Good evening, everyone. This is Rob Orson with the Emerging Revolutionary War. Welcome back to our third year of doing Sunday night chats, or Rev War revelries, as we call them. I'm joined with my good colleague here, Mark Malloy, who has a great background set up there for tonight's talk. We're very happy to have one of my good friends, James Bish, with us tonight to discuss his new book, I Can't Tell a Lie, which I have a copy of here. I know Mark has one as well. And the book talks about Parson Weems and the truth about George Washington's cherry tree, the Prairie Valley Forge, and other anecdotes. Before we turn over to Jim, just let everyone know that if you don't know who Parson Weems is, you're going to know by the end of tonight. Parson Weems is a Prince William County native here in Virginia, where I'm located, and he's one of the first biographers of George Washington, and his stories have been told over and over again throughout history since he published his first book. And Jim has done lots of research and a new look into Parson Weems and his connections to Washington, where some of these stories might have come from, and taking a different angle at this story, which I think is fantastic. It's always good to have people on with us who look at these topics and with a new, fresh light. Jim was a history teacher here in Virginia, and he volunteers at several different organizations, especially Culpeper Museum and Culpeper, Virginia, Historic Prince William, and other organizations as well. And Jim's a great friend of ours. And Jim, welcome to joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the Emerging Revolution having me on.
Yeah, and so we're just gonna get started with, kind of like I said, a broad overview. What brought you to this topic? Why did you write this book?
Well, I taught in Prince William County schools for over 30 years. I taught history at a high school there, and about 10 years into teaching, I began a local history course that they allowed me to teach in the high school level. So when you're teaching local history, you dig into everything that's local. And of course, as part of that, I would take Virginia history, then I'd come up, and of course, the Northern Neck impacted Prince William County in Northern Virginia quite often, because all those Northern Neck families eventually patented land up the Potomac River into Prince William, Fairfax, all of that area. And so I would follow all those families up, including the Carters, the Balls, the Lees, all those different families that had come up. And in doing so, I ran into the Washington family often, and I ran into the Ewell family often. And of course, the Ewell family has a pretty good background in Prince William County. So doing all that that teaching really brought me into the colonial time period of getting to know those families. And with that, I ran right into Parson Weems.
So who was he? So what's his background, and what drew him to write this book on George Washington?
Well, I think, and this is something most people don't realize, they attack Parson Weems, but they really don't know Parson Weems. They kind of look at him as a bubbling, book salesman, that's all he was concerned with, was making money and that type of thing. But the guy was really from a very wealthy family in Maryland, very wealthy. His grandmother came from Scotland with 3 children in the 1730s, the 1720s, and they settled. Two of her boys settled in Maryland. They were David Weems, who was Mason Weems's father, and the other one was James Weems, and he ends up with Billingsley Plantation in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, where he ends up taking over. Then they had a sister that married a very wealthy man by the name of William Moore from Pennsylvania, from Philadelphia area. And so he came from a lot of wealth. Wilhelmina Moore, Weems Moore, who married William Moore in Philadelphia, when they got married, he was the second wealthiest man, they claim, in Philadelphia. So they ran in some really wealthy circles. Weems's father was a merchant. He had a lot of kids, 19, I think 12 of them were surviving when Mason was born just south of Annapolis. And when he was born, his father and 2 brothers were running the merchant business going back from Europe to the colonies. And Weems was born in 1759 as the youngest of all those children. So he had a lot of older brothers one of the brothers, David Weems Jr., ended up taking over the merchant company after in the 1780s, and that line will be merchants in the Chesapeake area up through into the 20th century. They will introduce the first steamships in the Chesapeake. So Weems came from a very wealthy, connected family. So connected that they, after having that many children, they sent him to a boarding school, which was in Charles County around Port Tobacco. And that's where he was introduced to some of the wealthiest Marylanders. That was a very wealthy time for Port Tobacco area right before the Revolutionary War. And so Weems ended up going to medical school in England, and then came back home at the time of his father died in 1779 when the Revolutionary War was going on, and decided to change his occupation from medicine to being a reverend. I think it fit him a little bit better.
So go ahead.
You want me to keep going?
Yeah, go ahead. You go right ahead. You go right ahead.
I mean, from there, he became a reverend. Of course, that's not a good time to become a reverend at the end of the Revolutionary War. He was connected with Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, were ambassadors at the end of the Revolutionary War, because he needed to get to have a bishop approve of him being endorsed as a minister, because there weren't any in the colony or in the states at that time. And he finally was able to get that once they abridged the part where you had to swear loyalty to the crown. That was the hang up. And once they got around that, then he came back probably as the first endorsed reverend minister from England after the Revolutionary War. He ended up being rector of 2 parishes in Maryland. And those were both on a downturn. About 80% of the Church of England churches died after the Revolutionary War in Maryland. So it was not a good time to be head of a church of the Church of England, which became the Episcopal Church at that time.
How does he become a bookseller? So he's, a minister or Episcopal priest or pastor, and then he's known for anyone that knows Parson Weems knows him, his relationship with books.
Yes.
Which I have a problem with behind me here, and Mark has a problem with, and so do you, Jim. We all have problems with books. So we would have made Parson Weems a lot of money. So how did he make that transition?
Well, I think as his clientele was not attending church anymore. Before that time, the churches were financed through the state, through the colonies, and you had to depend on the parishioners at that point. And a lot of other denominations were starting to come in, that matched up with what people's beliefs were. So he was having a hard time, and he still wanted to preach, but he wanted to preach to the masses. And he went to a book fair in the early around 1792 in Philadelphia, which sold a lot of religious works. And he thought that was a good way. Maybe I could publish religious works. I could use them out in going to book fairs, going to county court days, things like that, so he could reach a broader audience. And that got him started, literally doing religious works. Got him started, and he started printing himself, writing himself a few religious pamphlets, small things that he began to publish, using a few publishers, some from Maryland, some from Philadelphia. So he gradually got a start that way into the publishing world.
Now,
So, go ahead, Mark.
He goes on to, his most famous association is with Washington, right? How did he, get turned on to that subject?
Well, this is another thing that I learned when I was doing research on Weems. Weems had a very influential cousin-in-law. His first cousin, who was Rebecca Moore, married William Smith, Reverend William Smith. And Reverend William Smith was hired by Benjamin Franklin in the 1750s to come into Philadelphia and create a college, basically. And so they created the College of Philadelphia. he became the first president of it, hired by Benjamin Franklin. And so Benjamin Franklin and him became very good friends. He ends up being president or the head of that college up through into the Revolutionary War for the next 20 years. And Reverend Smith just loved Washington. He first met him on the frontier in the 1750s, not long after he was in Pennsylvania. He met him when he was in the French and Indian War. And then the guy was just enamored with Washington, Smith was. When he again touched base with him during the Revolutionary War, when Washington was at Valley Forge and when he was at Philadelphia, he ended up, he was a Mason as well. So he ended up bringing him to a lot of events in Philadelphia. And the guy was just mesmerized with Washington, Smith was. In 1779, Smith took over the Kent County School of Maryland. He'd been released from his duties because they didn't know about if he was loyal enough to keep him in that position. And by the way, the College of Philadelphia later became Penn. That's the school. He was the first president of what today is Penn. So he started a new school. He wanted to change the name, so he asked Washington if he could name the school after him. And in the 1780s, in 1780, he went to Washington, and Washington at the time gave him the approval by 1782. And so he named it Washington College, which is in Chesterfield, Maryland. It's the oldest college named for the president. And just happened to be that when Weems was back after his father's death, he ended up attending there. And that's really where I think he was turned on to religion, was through his cousin-in-law, William Smith, turned him on to becoming a reverend instead of a doctor. And that's when he went and pursued his divinity degree. But he went to school under his cousin for about a year or so in Maryland. And that's where I think he was just enamored with Washington. His uncle, his cousin-in-law just was so enamored with Washington. And I think that fed into Weems. There's another connection that nobody has ever put together. And I mentioned it a little bit earlier. Weems went to Charles County as a teenager, went to a boarding school there. And it just happened to be the boarding school that the Craiks went to. It was, and that's where he was first connected with Craiks. Dr. James Craik, who had served with Washington in the French and Indian War, was in Charles County, Maryland, around Port Tobacco. So Weems knew the Craiks early. He knew the Craiks when he was 12, 13, and James Craik Jr. was just a year younger than Parson Weems. So they were attending the same school together in Charles County, Maryland. So he was introduced to the Craiks and was introduced to his cousin-in-law, and both of them had connections with Washington.
Yeah, that's an amazing part about your book, is all these different connections you tie in. Mark, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, one of the things I didn't realize that I did from your book was that Weems actually corresponded with Washington himself on a few different occasions, which I think typically when I've heard of Weems described, usually it's in the context of the 19th century, and it's usually almost as if there was little to no connection between Weems and Washington. So I found that really fascinating, that not only all these connections in the area and from different family members, but that he actually wrote back and forth with Washington at least a couple times.
Weems was very connected. Into the family. I should go back and say that Dr. Craik writes a letter to George Washington coming out of the French and Indian War and asking, okay, what shall I do? What advice should you give me about where I should go to start a practice after his military service is over with? We don't know the answers to that, but it wasn't within the year. Dr. Craik, James Craik, ends up marrying Mary Emney Yule. and Mary Amney Yule's mother was Sarah Ball Yule, who was a first cousin once removed to Mary Ball Washington. And they both grew up within 5 miles of each other. They were only a couple years apart, Sarah Ball Yule and Mary Ball Washington. So that connection, and I'm sure, I can't prove it, but I'm 99% sure that it was George Washington that probably introduced him to introduce Dr. James Craik to his cousin. And they were married in Bel Air Mansion there in Prince William County in 1760 before they moved on to Port Tobacco. So I'm sure there was that connection there. I should also mention that there were 3 people that were involved in the iron industry together that were connected, and that was Augustine Washington, George Washington's father, and Charles Yule and Nathaniel Chapman. All of those 3 people married Ball relatives, and they were all in the iron industry together. And Charles Yule came to Prince William County as an iron baron. He was looking for iron along the Neabsco and along the Occoquan. He died relatively young. He dies in the 1740s when he's in his late 30s. Don't know if it was a medical reason or it was an accident, but they had a brother, Bertrand Yule, that was also up there, and he ended up helping and stuff. But the Yules, Charles Yule was going places. He was married to Sarah Ball. So there's that connection with the Ball family and the Yules early. And it just happens to be that the person that inherited Bel Air Plantation after Charles Yule's death, it was his son, Jesse Yule, who ended up having a daughter named Fanny Yule. And Fanny Yule was the woman that married Mason Weems. Now, people always ask, one of the things is, okay, in 1795, after Weems started selling his pamphlets, in 1795, he marries Fanny Yule in Prince William County at Bel Air. He ends up marrying her in 1795. And I don't know for sure how, a lot of people don't understand how they ever made connections. They think that he ran into her when he was selling books through Dumfries, but the connection had to have been his connection with Dr. Craik, because Dr. Craik and Mary Amney Craik, or Yule Craik, his wife, she was the aunt to Fanny Yule. So I'm sure they introduced Fanny to Dr. Weems or Reverend Weems, because Reverend Weems knew the Craiks when he was a teenager. 1790s, I'm sure they were introduced, and that's the connection with all those. And by the way, Dr. Craik just happened to be Washington's closest friend from the French and Indian War to the deathbed, and he was with him all the way through the Revolutionary War, at his side, literally. Their tents commands were usually right next to each other. And that's the reason he took the positions that he did, Dr. Craik, so he could be close to the general.
Yeah, the Craigs had to introduce him to the Yules. There's no way he met his wife selling books. I just don't buy it.
No,
I don't buy it. That's a hard.
They had those family connections.
Yeah, definitely. And like you said, and Jim, the way you are able to keep all these, the Virginia, it's not a family tree, it's more of a family hedgerow together with all the names has always impressed me, because I get confused because they all use the same names, and the Balls pop up and the Yules pop up and the Craigs pop up. And that's one of the best things about your book, is you kind of make all these connections and you show how all these families are so connected. So I'm going to bring it up to when he produces the first version of his book. I know you'll get into this, how there's different versions of it. So Washington dies in 1799. And so there seems to be a mad rush to get a biography out. We know John Marshall was working on a biography of George Washington. How was Weems able to get something out pretty quick? When did he begin writing the book? Did he begin writing before Washington died or after Washington died?
Well, obviously, he married into the Ball family when he married Fanny Yule in 1795, which was 4 years before Washington dies. And he was enthralled with Washington. There's an encounter in 1787 in which Dr. James Craik Jr., who Weems had gone to school with, probably at the plantation school in in Charles County, Maryland, how Dr. James Craik Jr. takes him to Mount Vernon one day. And that's in Washington's diary, how he stays there overnight. And so that tells you how far back Weems was probably fascinated with Washington. I'm sure he wanted to meet him. One thing that Washington doesn't say is where he came from. He says afterward they were heading back to Port Tobacco, but he doesn't say where they came from. I'm convinced that they stayed with Sina Ball McCarty, who only lived about 5 miles from there. The McCartys and the Washingtons, again, first cousin once removed, they were very close. They moved up to Fairfax County in the 1730s. Sina at that time was a little girl. She was about 4 years older than George. Her mother had died in 1730. So when George was born in 1732, Sina was living with her father and 6 other siblings under the age of 8. So all of that was going on as kind of a sideshow. So the McCartys and the Washingtons were close up there before they moved to Fredericksburg. And so Washington, I should say Weems, he knew about the families and all of those connections. So Weems, I think, had a good background on Washington through his cousin-in-law, through obviously the Craiks, through his wife and their connections. So there's no doubt that I have that Weems had been collecting stories, asking people from 1795 and before. He writes Washington a number of times after their encounter in 1787. He writes him while he's president in Philadelphia. So from 1792 until 1799, just months before Washington's death, there's correspondence between Weems and Washington. And I'm thinking, we all know none of us are living forever. So I'm sure that sooner or later he realized that Washington was not going to be around anymore. And he was ready. He had family members. He had friends that knew Washington. And I think he was ready from the start. He'd been writing already by that most of the decade of the early 1790s. So he was prepared. He was prepared whenever that time came.
So can you talk about a little bit about the different versions that came out? I know there's the one that came out, he's got different revisions of this book that seem to have a little bit different, stories in them that, because if you pick up a copy, it might be, depending on what version it is, you might not have everything that you see in a later version.
Yeah, his first versions were small pamphlets. They were 60 to 80 pages long. They weren't very large. That's what he was selling. They were flying off the shelves, as he said it. And by 1806, he was publishing the fifth volume, or the 5th edition. It came out in 1806. I think what happened was that Jesse Ball ends up dying right before 1805 in Bel Air. And I'm sure that his sister, who was Mary Amney Craik, and probably even his aunt, who was Sina Ball McCartney, quite possibly came to Bel Air to say, to visit when his health was in decline. And at that point, I'm sure they all knew Washington very well. And by that time, the book was his pamphlet was doing so well that he probably knew. And by that time, he was hooked up with Matthew Carey, who was the largest publisher in the country at that time out of Philadelphia. He was selling books for him. And so I'm sure that in 1805, he knew he was going to publish a much larger volume. And it came out in 1806. It was the 5th edition. It included the cherry tree story. It included the prayer at Valley Forge. It included a variety of things that hadn't been earlier. And I'm sure, to me, I'm thinking they were probably just saying, when you write your enlarged volume, make sure this story gets in there, make sure this story gets in there, because there's no doubt that the Ewell family knew all the stories of Sina Ball and what she had been. Sina Ball undoubtedly spent some time as a girl at Mount Vernon. She spent some time at Cedar Run Farm, which was the McCartney place in Fairfax County. And she knew a lot of stories. And the Ewells knew a lot of stories because they were in the iron business with George's father. So those families were close and they knew stories. And I'm sure they told, you got to get this story in, you got to get this anecdote in. And 1807 or 1806, the big book came out. It was over 200 pages, and it pretty much remained that length through after that, after 1806. But that was the big jump with the famous anecdotes were included in the 1806 volume.
I got a question. So as you say, it's very popular. Could you speak on like how popular his stories were? Because I feel like, you know, Abraham Lincoln and later people specifically point to Weems's book as being, you know, kind of the book that they grew up reading about Washington, and how long, what was the longevity of its popularity, and then when did it like stop being popular? And it seems like it was fairly soon thereafter that then a lot of the stuff was simply discounted. Could you just talk a little bit about that, the life of these books and what happened to them?
I could talk a lot about that. The popularity of Weems's book, The Life of George Washington, really never died in popularity until probably the 20th century. It was always in print well into the 20th century. So it went through over 100 editions. I mean, it just flew off the shelves. Weems really wasn't attacked until the 1880s. Henry Cabot Lodge was the first major historian. He was senator from Massachusetts in 1889. Almost 90 years after Weems publishes the first book, and after everybody else that knew Washington and the new Weems had passed away, in 1889, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, wrote a book on Washington, and he called Weems' stuff a joke. He said that no good Virginian in the 1730s would talk the way Weems said that they talked. And I'm thinking, I don't know if any New Englander knew how anybody in Virginia talked in the 1730s, because it was definitely different. But then after that, Woodrow Wilson, a few years later, writes a book on Washington, and he agrees with Henry Cabot Lodge. They don't give any proof. They just say it wouldn't have happened. And then after that, you've got a number of William Thayer, who was the head of the American Historical Association. He starts attacking him. And then by the 20th century, the historians just laugh and talk about Weems, and none of them ever offer any proof or even know who Weems is or try to even come up with a connection. They just claim that Weems made it up. He wasn't connected to the Washington family. And there's, as I said earlier, there's a lot of mystery about how Weems ended up meeting Washington at Mount Vernon with Dr. James Craik Jr. And they don't realize Minister Bishop, who was can't think of his name right now. He was a bishop in Virginia, wrote a book on the churches of Virginia, the initial churches of Virginia. And he's the one that said he knew the Weems family, which he did. And he knew Weems because they were both ministers. And he's the one that said that he was at the Charles County schools. So all those connections, end up happening where Weems and Washington are connected. But as far as his books, and another thing that I think Weems falls short, or the people don't realize how great he is. I consider him the Mark Twain of the early 19th century. A few literary critics in the last 20 years have recognized what a great author he was. He was the most well-read author from 1800 to 1840 in America. And he's really the first author of any importance after the Revolution. And people kind of disregard that, but there were, like you said, Abraham Lincoln, if you go back into that pre-1860 time period, there hardly is a school child that hadn't read Weems. And he's really dominant. And I think the attacks in the 20th century on him have really cut down, impacted how famous this guy should be. Because he's starting to get a little traction on the literary scene now, but he really was America's first author. Before that time, we were British authors coming over, but he was really America's first author with an American voice, the way Americans talk. common Americans. And so he was very important. His literary works, most read author. He wrote the way people read or talked, and his books just flew off the shelves. He sold them. He always tells how his Life of Washington, he can't keep it in print while he was alive.
I think too, when you look at it compared to Marshall's biography of Washington, which is it 5 volumes, or I forget?
I think it's 4.
4 volumes, yeah. You know, if you are an average American, you can't really afford a lot of books, and you want to buy something about Washington, you're probably going to gravitate toward Weems's book rather than 4 volumes by John Marshall, right? I mean, so I think that's a little bit to it as well. Like you said, he spoke more of a common voice, and also obviously one book of 200 pages thereabout is a little bit more affordable for most Americans than a 4-volume set that, you know, someone with more money would be able to get.
One other thing that Weems did that wasn't being done at the time to a large extent is he was taking the bookstore to rural America. You know, 95% of America was very rural, small town, farmers, things like that. And they had no access to books, where he was really a first. He would take his bookstore in his wagon, and he would, in his Jersey wagon, and he would fill it up with books, and he'd go out to these small towns and he would start talking, where the East Coast cities had bookstores, your Philadelphias, your Bostons, your New Yorks. Urban people could get books, but the rural people just couldn't. And he really opened up doors to becoming really the first door-to-door salesman, which was very unique. It became a thing in the 19th century, selling books that way. And most of the best sellers were former reverends, because one, they were trusted being a reverend, and they communicated well. So he really was suited to sell books. And of course, when you're writing a book and then you're great at selling books, it's kind of a good match. The unfortunate thing of that was it was costly being on the road all the time. So that was both hard on his body physically, and it was demanding on the pocketbook. Even though Matthew Carey, the publisher, hired him to do so, it was tough, and it was demanding both economically and physically for Weems.
Yeah, I'm sure it was hard on his family. Mark travels all the time, right, Mark? So Mark's gonna yell at me later for that. I want to bring up the cherry tree story because it's behind Mark right now. Mark, your head is blocking the creepy George Washington face there. That painting always weirds me out. But it's more artistic than reality. So the cherry tree story, one of the things I found out in your book and just talking with you weeks ago when the book came out, is where the cherry tree story took place. So Mark and I live near Fredericksburg in Virginia here. Obviously, we've always been taught that the cherry tree story happened down, at Ferry Farm, where Washington grew up as a young boy after they moved from Northern Neck. But you have a different take on that. Can you share a little bit about your research and what your take is on where the cherry tree story probably took place?
Yeah, it's really not me, it's Weems. Weems tells us where it took place. And nobody reads Weems, they just attack him. Weems says that the source was a female that was a distant cousin to Washington, that was a little bit older than Washington. They both were children. And he gives the date of the fall of 1737. He gives that date when he's talking about how the orchards God provides fruit in the fall, to take care of us. And so that's one story. And then he later comes up and he says the same person that I told that anecdote in right about the time George Washington turns 6. Well, George Washington turned 6 in February 22nd or February 11th, the old calendar, of 1738. So both of those, the fall of 1737 through February of 1738, it's about a 4-month time frame in there. And during that time period, Washington was living at Little Hunting Creek in actually Prince William County at the time. It doesn't turn to be Fairfax County until 1742. But it was Little Hunting Creek, which later Lawrence, Washington will name Mount Vernon. So Washington lived there for 3 years. They didn't move to Fredericksburg until November or December of 1738, when George was 6 3/4 months old, or 3/4 years old. So Weems tells everybody where the story took place, and it makes sense. Mary Ball, Washington, and Augustine, Washington, and Little George were up at Little Hunting Creek, which is now Mount Vernon. Sarah Ball, who had married Dennis McCarty, they were living at Cedar Grove Plantation, which is only about 5 miles from Mount Vernon. They both were on the Truro Parish vestry together. They were making decisions all that time period. And they were close. The Balls were close. Mary Ball, Washington, and Sarah Ball were first cousins. And I'm sure at that point, Sina Ball, who was a second cousin to George, when he turned 6, she was turning 10. She was born in February of 1728. So I'm sure she was visiting both her cousin, which Mary Ball was her father's first cousin, and Sarah Ball was her father's niece. So I'm sure she was up there living with them at time periods while her single father, who had lost his wife, was down in Lancaster County dealing with that. So that's where the setting really was. And anybody that really reads what Weems says could figure that out, but nobody cares. What happened in the early 20th century, there was a guy that bought Ferry Farm, and he wanted to figure out a way to make money off of Ferry Farm. So he started broadcasting that come to Ferry Farm. We've got cherry trees. We've got the original cherry tree, all that. So he was advertising Ferry Farm as the place where the cherry tree stood, when it really wasn't. And of course, people believe what they were told. And it really wasn't that.
That's fascinating. I really like, and they are now, the 20th century, just attacking Weems and not taking it really seriously, any of these anecdotes. But I'm interested what the reaction was from most people at the time of its publication. Do we know any sort of, you mentioned he has all these connections with the family, but does the family ever say anything about his book? And in particular, I'm really interested in George Washington Parke Custis, who was George Washington's adopted grandson. I believe he thought of himself as the holder of the Washington family legacy in many respects. What was some of the reaction from, or do we know from people from when Weems's books first came out?
Well, one thing that I do know is that none of the Washington family members that were close said anything bad about the book. If it would have been a lot of lies, they would have reacted. Mason Weems actually dedicates his first copy to Martha Washington, and it was dedicated to her. George Washington Parke Custis, he ends up putting in another anecdote in his works later on by the 1850s about George Washington can't tell a lie when he kills one of his mother's favorite colts. The colt evidently had a heart attack when he was trying to ride it. It got overexcited, and Parke Custis tells about the story that he told his mother. He says, "I will admit I killed your favorite colt," and that didn't come from Weems. That came from George Washington Parke Custis. He never said anything derogatory towards Weems, that anything he had ever written, that Weems had ever written, was wrong. Neither did his sister ever say anything. Miss Lewis, did she ever say anything about what Weems wrote was wrong? And a lot of stuff that Weems has in his book, Parke Custis did too, that came from Dr. Craik. And Dr. Craik and the Weemses were very close after the marriage, So, in fact, Dr. Craik ends up telling about the famous story that during the French and Indian War, that Washington was hit 2 or 3 times and bullet holes went through the jacket, and he never was killed. And then later on their trip out west, they ran into one of the Native Americans that were fighting against Washington in 1755, and relayed to him that story that you must have had his shield around you. And Craik was with Washington when he was told that story. That shows up in George Washington Parke Custis's books. But George Washington Parke Custis, you can't condemn him because he grew up in the Washington family. He would have known the stories. So historians have pretty much laid off of George Washington Parke Custis. And because they never tried to find out the connection with Parson Weems, they decided he's the guy that will attack. None of Washington's close family members ever said a word against Weems. None of them that knew Washington very well ever said a word. In fact, Weems's and Yule family members clear into the 20th century in newspaper accounts tell reporters that claim that Weems made up the stories. I've got resources in newspapers where they're defending Weems and saying that the Yule family, those stories were passed down generation after generation. But of course, historians say, well, you would say that because you're a member of the family, you're descended from the Yule family or the Weems family. But who else would know those stories except Yule, Weems, or Ball's family members?
Now, I think that's a really convincing argument because, and you're right. I feel like Custis's stories, they're frequently cited because of his connection, and like you said, Weems has this similar connection that's just kind of ignored, and so he's just the bookseller trying to make a buck. But yeah, no, but I find that really fascinating that the time period. You would imagine if these were fabricated stories that members of the family would be pretty vocal about the fact that these were, not true. So I find that really interesting.
Yeah, and another thing that I always thought funny. I don't know about you. You both are married. I'm married. I don't think I would go very far writing lies about my wife's relatives. I mean, there's something there that I think, and you have to understand too, Weems was quite respected. Whenever I run across somebody in the 1820 to 1810 and they talk about Weems, they talk about how he was eccentric, but they always say that he was one of the most respected people in the community, that he that he was someone that everybody liked, that he was the most famous person in the neighborhood. They never put him down. They always say that he was welcoming when they had the court days in Dumfries, that his house was always open for anybody and everybody to come to. And so I never ever get that this was a guy that was going to lie. Two of his closest friends were reverends. Lee Massey. Lee Massey ended up burying Patsy Custis. He gave the sermon and was the minister. And Weems visits him a lot. He's quoted in Weems's work. There's an account, a couple newspapers were there together. Weems says they're very close friends. Massey never denies it in any of his work. And of course, Spence Grayson. Spence Grayson was the half brother to, or step brother to, Weems's father-in-law, Jesse Ewell. So Sarah Ewell, after Charles Ewell passed away, she ends up marrying Benjamin Grayson, and so they're step family for a while. So there's that connection. So Weems was respected. He wasn't somebody that was going to tell lies. He just wasn't that kind of a guy.
One of the debates Mark and I've always had is about Washington's religious beliefs, and part of that is that story at Valley Forge. And you're right, a lot. I'm looking at the pages right now in your book about the story that shows up in this 1808 version, the 6th edition, you say, about Washington kneeling and praying at Valley Forge, which is something when I was a kid I read about. It was in a textbook that I had as a kid. That this, when I first went to Valley Forge, I wanted to know exactly where Washington kneeled. So talk a little bit, excuse me, about that story and through your research, where you think some of the basis for that story comes from.
Okay, yeah, that's something that I never knew, but I always knew that if I followed the family or connections of Weems and or the Ewell family, that I would get to where the connections were of his anecdotes. And that anecdote comes from actually the Weems connection from Philadelphia. As I mentioned earlier, William Smith, who was Weems's first cousin's husband in Philadelphia, that was a reverend, very well known. In fact, William Smith gives a eulogy to Ben Franklin's funeral. He was the primary eulogy at Benjamin Franklin's funeral. He had a lot of money. He owned thousands of acres of land. His stepfather, William Moore, lived just to the west of Valley Forge. And William Smith himself ends up owning a house on the current grounds of Valley Forge. He owned it from the 1760s. So it was already under William Smith's ownership and his wife before Valley Forge occurred. Isaac Potts, who the story was about, he owned the house that Washington's headquarters was in. And I talk about, I looked at some of the works of the 19th century, and they talk about movement, how the Quakers at that time, to feed the army, the Quakers were allowed to bring their stuff in to get milled for the army, and then they were allowed to take some milled good back for bread. And they said that they pretty much had free basis because of the needs of the Continental Army during that winter. And since Potts would have owned the place, he would have also had free will. At the time, he lived in Pottsville, which was about 20 miles north of there, but he would have had free reign. He owned where Washington was headquartered. So it makes sense that he was there. The original story, I've read some works from Potts's own family that deviate a little bit. They never say who the wife was. They mention the wife, or Weems ends up mentioning the wife, and he gets the wife's name wrong. I think what happened was he was told that it was Isaac Potts's wife, but Weems probably checked to see who Isaac Potts' wife was when he was hearing the story. Probably came from Reverend Smith himself, because Reverend Smith's grandson said during the winter of Valley Forge that he was up in Valley Forge preaching. He was one of the few reverends that went up there and preached during that cold winter. And I think he probably heard it from Reverend Smith that his wife, so he ended up finding out the name of Isaac Potts's wife. But by 1800, Isaac Potts's wife was different than it was in 1778. His wife had died. His first wife had died by 1780, and he remarried. So Weems mistakenly uses the name of his second wife, Isaac Potts's second wife, and that gets attacked by historians. But as far as him being religious, Washington was a member of two churches. He helped both Christ Church in Alexandria and Pohick Church, who in Truro Parish. He was the highest. He gave more money to both those churches than any other parishioner. He was on the Truro Parish vestry board for 30 some years. No doubt he was religious. Lee Massey said that he was one of his best church attendees, who was the reverend at Pohick Church. And many people that were around Mount Vernon have documented that they would often see Washington kneeling in prayer early in the morning. That was kind of his routine. So, it's not that fabulous of a story, but historians have made it out to be something that's very unusual, to the point where I've heard one historian say that Washington wouldn't kneel at Mount Vernon because he wouldn't want to get his trousers dirty. And I'm thinking, if you were worried about that, that's not something Washington would have thought about when you're riding horses and all this stuff.
One of the things I'm looking through your book right now, and you have on page 259, and I put the link on the chat for anyone interested in buying Jim's book. I highly recommend it. You list a lot of the anecdotes, who wrote it, Weems or Park Custis, and then what you believe to be the source for the story, which I think, this is really good information right here for people that know that Weems, the biography of Washington, knows some of these anecdotal stories. You have it here where you think which connection Weems used to gain the information on these stories. It's a lot of research. So with your research, what was the most, I have to ask, since we ask all of our authors this that we bring on, what was the most interesting or surprising thing you found doing all this research?
Well, probably going back 20 some years, I've been working on this. I haven't been writing, but because of my position teaching local history, I was learning all this stuff, which would infuriate me when Washington historians would get on and say that all these things were a lie when I knew the Ewell family and the Ball family, and that's tough to deal with. But I would say the surprising thing that I ran into was the Weems family. I was, as Mark mentioned earlier, he was kind of a bumbling book writer and book salesman, and nobody gave him much credit. And when I found how much wealth Weems's family had, it was really shocking to me. Weems's dad provided a number of schooners, a number of ships for the American Revolution. His uncle was one of the wealthiest men in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, and his other aunt and uncle were among the wealthiest in Philadelphia. And that's the thing that really surprised me, is how much wealth Weems came from and how many influential people Weems knew. And that was a little bit later, because I didn't know that until the last 3 or 4 years of research before I wrote the book. I knew a lot about the Ball family and the Ewell and the Washington, but in order to really understand Weems, I had to know him. And that was the big eye opener for me, was how wealthy Weems's family and the kind of people he came from, his stock.
So I'm going to ask you, since you're a big fan of Washington, other than Parson Weems's Life of Washington, what is your favorite biography of George Washington?
My favorite biography of George Washington,
other than the Parson Weems book.
I actually like, oh man, got me on the spot. The guy that was doing his papers at the University of Virginia, editing his papers, and it was about Weems and the myth of George Washington. I can't come up with his name. I can see him, but I can't think of his name.
Yeah.
Lindell, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Edward. And but that one I thought was pretty good. He didn't condemn Weems too bad. He talked a lot about other things that kind of mythic. And one of the things, the McGuffey readers, McGuffey really started adding things to Weems's words, and when they started putting in the readers, and by the 1830s, so he kind of made stories that Weems really didn't say. For example, cutting down a cherry tree. Weems never said that. Weems' father said he barked the cherry tree, a small English cherry tree, which you give a boy, a 5 or 6 year old boy, a little axe, they're going to be hacking on things. And I'm sure this little English cherry tree got barked to the point where he said he didn't think it would survive. And then it gets into Washington cut down a cherry tree. There's a big leap from barking a tree to cutting it down. And those are later writers that kind of made those leaps that Weems gets accused of.
That's a good point. It's not, I was just reading it. Mark and I were reading it a few weeks ago. Yeah, it says bark, not chopped. So we always talk about chopping down a cherry tree. And it's interesting, these stories still resonate, even though, as you said, many historians have been discounting Weems for the past 100 years. But, even my son, who just finished 4th grade, knows these stories from school. So they're still resonating some way, somehow, whether it's the true history of Washington or the mythology of Washington. I think they're still there. And I think that's what makes your book, very relevant today, is these stories are still told. Most Americans know the cherry tree. They probably don't know about the barking of the tree, know more about the chopping of the tree. They talk about the kneeling at Valley Forge up there at Valley Forge. So I think some of these stories just still resonate. People just know them, and whether they know them because they're true or wrong, or false. But I think the fact that you've got all this research connecting Weems, who he was, like you said, it's important to study the man that wrote these stories, and his connections with people that knew Washington. As Mark mentioned earlier, one of the most fascinating things you point out in the book is throughout his life, these contemporaries of Washington, his members of his family, never write in any papers or anywhere, this is all garbage. They never do it. And that's interesting.
Yeah, to me, that tells me a lot. You know, if you have something that's a lie, especially your wife's family, people are going to write about it. So that to me gives a lot of credibility to what Weems was saying when close family members of Washington never speak up. And they certainly could have. Like you mentioned before, George Washington Parke Custis, he kind of was the holder of all the legends of Washington and never said a word against Weems.
Yeah, no, I find it all really fascinating. And to Rob's point, despite over 100 years of these are all made up things, as he said, these stories, my 6-year-old knows the story of Washington in the tree. And we went to Ferry Farm for his birthday celebration. They still do a contest to throw a stone across the Rappahannock. They're still and they're talking, these stories are still in the zeitgeist. People still know them, even though most people think that a lot of people think that they're false stories. And I think that your research, I really hope, makes people think twice about Weems and all these anecdotes, and that there might be more truth to them than they would otherwise give them credit for. But also, me and Rob are, work in public history as well. There's lots of historic sites. You mentioned, Poick Church. I saw one of our viewers has some a family there. You mentioned Poick Church. You mentioned Mount Vernon, Ferry Farm. There's also the Weems Bots Museum. What do you think is the best place for somebody to go to learn about George Washington or Weems, and then and hopefully, some of these places can continue to look into Weems and these stories and try and dissect more of the truth from them?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of good places. as you in Prince William County, Weems Bots is there. Certainly, all of these places. The Blackburn family really connected into the Washington family at Ripon Lodge, and there's just Mount Vernon. One of the places that nobody knows about, and I know that it was the place that Washington, that the McCarty story Sina told Parson Weems, and that's Mount Ayr in Fairfax County. There is a historical site now. It burned down in the 1990s, but I'm sure that's where Parson Weems, 20 years before he wrote the book, and he said 20 years before when he first learned of the story, that's where the story was told, at Mount Ayr in Fairfax County. And I know that he wrote the book either at Bel Air Plantation in Prince William County or his home on Main Street in Dumfries. That's where the story was written. So there's a lot to be proud of. And of course, as I said, Parson Weems, the most read author for 40 years, the beginning of the 19th century, and nobody's really given him his due respect. His burial place is at Bel Air. It's just a fascinating person. I always go, one last thing, I always go and ask people whenever I give a talk, how many of you have heard the cherry tree story? Every hand goes up. Then they say, how many of you believe the cherry tree story is true? No hands go up. Historians have for 140 years been telling, in my view, a big lie for 140 years, and they cannot put up any proof that it's a lie. And half of them have never even read Weems or anything about him, but they still flaunt that story.
That's great. I love your passion, Jim. And for those watching, again, the link to buy this book is in the chat. Here's a book right here. Mark has this copy. It's a great read. Jim, thank you for joining us tonight. Really appreciate you sharing this passion. We only touched on the very surface of all this stuff that you have in here about these different stories about Weems and the connections. If you want to know more, please pick up Jim's book. In 2 weeks, join us right back here for Emerging Rev War Revelry. Will be just our ERW members talking about battlefields of the Revolutionary War, just talking about our favorite battlefields, some of the most unknown battlefields and great places to visit. So just be an evening of us having a drink and just talking some history. So Jim, thanks again. And thank you everyone for watching, and you all have a great week. Take care.
Well, thank you to the Emerging Revolutionary War. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Mark.
Thank you.